Colossians 1:16 is teaching that there was a new creation created in connection with Christ Jesus. It's not about Jesus creating the world or the Genesis creation. Now, when I say new creation, I'm referring to anything that happened after Jesus' resurrection and exaltation to the right hand of the Father. Anything that happens in that time frame is considered part of the new creation. And that's what Paul has in mind here in Colossians 1. Let's read verses 15 through 20, just to get a nice picture of the whole passage. It says, "He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation, because in connection with him all things were created in heaven and on earth, the visible and the invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him, and he is above all things, and in connection with him all things are held together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from among the dead, so that he would come to have first place in everything. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him God was pleased to reconcile all things to himself, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood that was shed on the cross." The first reason why this passage is not about Jesus creating the world is because the things that are created are things in heaven and things on earth. We see that in verse 16. Not the heavens and the earth. That's not what's created in this creation that Paul is referring to. He's presupposing that the heavens and the earth have already been created because he's referring to the creation of things in heaven and on earth. That must mean the heavens and the earth already exist. The second reason why this is not about Jesus creating the world is because Paul fails to mention even one thing from the Genesis creation in this list of things that were created. If Paul was intending to tell us that the Genesis creation was created through Jesus, he did a really bad job because he doesn't mention one thing that was created in the Genesis creation. Neither thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, not one of those things is found in Genesis. It would be like if I was explaining to somebody that I went to a baseball game and I said, yeah, the players were little kids. There wasn't even a concession stand. There was about 40 people in the crowd. You would know by how I'm describing it that I'm not describing a Major League Baseball game. I didn't mention one characteristic of Major League Baseball games. What I was describing was a Little League Baseball game. So just because a Major League Baseball game and a Little League Baseball game are both baseball games, you can tell by my description that I'm referring to a Little League game, not to a Major League game. It's the same thing with Colossians. By the way he's describing this creation, we know that Paul is not referring to the Genesis creation. This strongly suggests that he's referring to a different creation, the new creation. The third reason why this is not about the creation of the world is because we learn from Ephesians 1:20 through 22 that the language of thrones, dominions, rulers, and authorities are put under Jesus' feet after he's exalted. So they are new creation terms, not Genesis creation terms. Let's read Ephesians 1:20 through 22. It says, "His mighty strength that he worked in Christ when he raised him from among the dead and seated him at his right hand in the heavenly places, far above every ruler and authority and power and dominion and every name that is named, not only in this age, but also in the one to come. And he put all things in subjection under his feet and appointed him as the head over all things related to the church." So in Colossians 1, when we read that these things are created in connection with Christ, that occurs after his exaltation, not in Genesis. Remember, none of the things that Paul names are plants or animals or the sun and the moon. Not one of those things does he name. He names these things that Paul connects in Ephesians 1 to the church. The fourth reason why this passage is not about Jesus creating the world is because the context surrounding Colossians 1:16 is about the kingdom of heaven beforehand and the church afterward. So that's the context, the surrounding context, the kingdom of heaven and the church. What are both of those things? Those are new creation realities. Those are New Testament, New Covenant realities. So it would be very strange to talk about the kingdom of heaven, which is a new covenant reality, then talk about the Genesis creation, then talk about the church. It would make for a much more smooth thought to be referring to the kingdom of heaven, which is a new covenant reality, the new creation, which is a new covenant reality, and the church, which is a new covenant reality. Paul's train of thought would be much more smooth. The fifth reason this passage is not about the Genesis creation is because the all things that were created in verse 16 are the same all things that are reconciled in Colossians 1:20. Remember, verse 16 says, in connection with him, all things were created in heaven and on earth. Now let's read verse 20, which uses the same language. It says, and through him, God was pleased to reconcile all things to himself, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood that was shed on the cross. Are all things in the Genesis creation reconciled to God? No, but all things in the new creation are. Notice in verse 20, it uses the same language. It says, all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven. That's the same term he uses in verse 16, the things on earth or the things in heaven. Now, how did he do this reconciling? By his death on the cross. When did that happen? 4,000 years or so after the Genesis creation or longer. So this all things terminology is not referring to all things in the Genesis creation, but all things that are reconciled to God, which is all things in the new creation. The sixth reason why this passage is not about the Genesis creation is because Paul's language in Colossians 1:17 of Christ being above all things is in reference to a time period after his exaltation, not to the Genesis creation. Firstly, let me address the translation above all things. There are only two places in the rest of the New Testament that this phrase occurs, pra ponton, by itself, and it's in 1 Peter 4:8 and James 5:2, and in both of those places it means first in rank, not first in time. So when pra ponton occurs by itself, it's referring to somebody being above all, first in rank, not first in time. And this is exactly how the phrase occurs in Colossians 1:17. It occurs by itself. So it's also best understood to mean above all things. Now, does Jesus being above all things have to do with the Genesis creation or the new creation? Let's read Ephesians 1:22, the parallel passage. It says, and he put all things in subjection under his feet and appointed him as the head over all things related to the church. Notice how he uses the language in Ephesians of over all things, and in Colossians he says above all things. This is the same language, and it's referring to Christ's position after his exaltation to the right hand of the Father. It's not referring to the Genesis creation. Again, when were all these things subject to Christ? It was after his exaltation. God put all things in subjection under him. That means Jesus becomes over all things and above all things. All of this language that Paul is using is referring to his state at the right hand of the Father, not to the Genesis creation. The seventh reason why this passage is not about Jesus creating the world is because Paul uses the same language of everything being held together in him to refer to the church, not to the Genesis creation. So this hold together language that Paul uses in Ephesians and Colossians, which are two very closely parallel books, always refers to the church, never to the Genesis creation. For example, in Colossians 2:19 we read, and not holding fast to the head, from whom the whole body, being supported and held together by the ligaments and sinews, grows. And likewise, in Ephesians 4:15-16 we read, but speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in every way into him who is the head, Christ, from whom the whole body, being fitted together and held together by every supporting ligament, and he goes on to finish, but we see that this language of being held together has nothing to do with the material creation. It has everything to do with the church being held together by the head, which is Christ. He's using this metaphorical body language to bring a point across. Paul is not saying that Jesus has some mysterious power pre-incarnation to hold the universe together. That is not at all the way he's using this language. Rather, he's saying that in connection with Jesus, the whole church is held together. Without Jesus, the church, the new creation, would fall apart. Why? Because Jesus is the head, and without a head, a body falls apart. And the last reason Colossians 1:16 is not about Jesus creating the world is because in the rest of the Bible, it's very explicit that God created the world in the Genesis creation by himself. Isaiah 44:24 says, I am Yahweh who makes all things, who alone stretches out the heavens, who spreads out the earth by myself. Malachi 2:10 says, do we not all have one Father? Hasn't one God created us? 2 Kings 19:15 says, O Yahweh, God of Israel, who is enthroned above the cherubim, you are the God, you alone, of all the kingdoms of the earth. You have made the heavens and the earth. These passages are really clear that it's not one being in three persons who created the world. It's one being, one I, who created the world, not a we. Now, I know many Trinitarians will immediately think, well, what about Genesis 1:26, where it says, let us make mankind in our image? God is likely speaking to his divine counsel there. Why? I'm not just making this up, but because in the very next verse, in Genesis 1:27, it says that God created humankind in his image. And all the pronouns and verbs in that sentence are singular. God created singular humankind in his image. So it's not a tri-personal being whose image man is created in. It's a singular being, a singular person whom mankind is created in the image of. So the Old Testament is unanimous in attributing the Genesis creation to the Father alone. Even in the New Testament, Jesus himself credits that creation to the Father. He says, the Creator made them male and female in Matthew 19:4. So for all these reasons, Colossians 1 should be understood to be a new creation passage, that all things in the new creation were created in connection with Christ Jesus. Everything in Colossians 1:15 through 20 is about the new creation and the church. My Trinitarian friends, I hope that you would reconsider that Colossians 1:16 is simply not about the Genesis creation. It does not teach that Jesus is some pre-existent divine figure. Rather, it teaches that Jesus is exalted and preeminent over the new creation and the church right now. Lastly, I want to end with 3 reasons why Jesus is not God, even in this passage. That's often considered a very strong Trinitarian passage. And they're all in Colossians 1:15. All of them are in one verse. Colossians 1:15 reads, He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. You cannot be the image of yourself. That's the first reason. If Jesus is God, he's not the image of God. The coin that has Caesar's image on it is not Caesar himself. The image is not the same thing as the thing that it's imaging. So that's the first reason why Jesus is clearly not God in this passage. Secondly, it calls God invisible, yet Jesus is clearly visible. If Jesus is part of the Trinity, then God is not invisible because Jesus is visible. So to call God invisible makes 0 sense, unless God is just the Father. And the third reason is that Colossians 1:15 calls Jesus the firstborn of all creation. It's the genitive there in Greek. And it's most likely here being used as a partitive genitive, like he's part of creation. He's the firstborn, which is part of creation. But it does not say that Jesus was the firstborn over creation, which the NIV translates. There's a perfect word in Greek which means over. It's huper. Paul did not use that. Paul was not trying to say Jesus was the firstborn over creation. That's true, but that's not what he's saying here. He says he's the firstborn of creation, which means he's part of creation. He is a created being. Therefore, he is not God. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider donating in the link below. And as always, please like and subscribe to help more people see content like this.